Education co-signed a letter saying leaving the EU without a deal would be an academic, cultural and scientific setback from which it would take decades to recover. As you know, we have a deal, but it does not cover this funding. It does not cover even half of what we had coming in from the EU. And we have had, unfortunately, a huge net loss. What's more, EU citizens are entitled to obviously study at universities across the bloc on the same terms as locals. And this is huge. For example, Brits who wanted to attend a university in the Netherlands, where tuition costs around £2,000 per year, compared to £9,250 in the UK, were able to do so. Tuition fees from non-EU nations are significantly higher. At Leiden University in the Netherlands, fees for non-EU students range between €10,000 and €17,000. So one particularly disappointing consequence of Brexit, as Julie touched on, was despite promising not to, the government obviously also ended the Erasmus exchange programme, which has provided the opportunity for 3 million Europeans to study abroad since its genesis. Again, not a small number. So how are we replacing legislation? Brexit left a right black hole in our legal framework because so much domestic law was derived from the EU. So the answer to this lies in a new category of domestic law called retained EU law, which is comprised of 4 different categories. 1, EU-derived domestic legislation like the Competition Act, which prohibits anti-competitive trade behaviour. 2, the second category would be direct EU legislation. And again, this is all directly effective EU law, so things like EU regulations and EU decisions that applied in the UK at the end of the transition period. Number 3 is all of the remaining rights, powers, liabilities or obligations, restrictions, remedies and procedures that were available under Section 21 of the 1972 Act. So these are things like EU treaties, together with directly effective rights and directives. And the 4th is retained EU case law. So this is all of the decisions of the Court of Justice for the European Union that were handed down before the end of the transition period. And finally, what still needs replacing? There's still made a lot of questions about the ECHR, the European Convention on Human Rights, for example, and how this will be devolved. But there is also a different type of loss, an intangible one, which isn't based on funding or rights or tax. It's an incalculable loss of cultural exchange, of diversity, of minds broadened by travel and education made easier, of multiculturalism, potential friendships and working relationships and international collaboration. If you have kids or plan to have kids, like Julie said, they're not going on any Erasmus exchange program that was anywhere near what we had. And also, as she so eloquently alluded to, conservative governments do not do well when their hate rhetoric is dissolved by international unity, when their divisive narratives are overcome by the strength of multilateral bonds, and when their corruption is exposed by the contrast of other governments and a spectrum of different media. The one thing that I've taken for the pandemic as a silver lining is that it's politicized a hell of a lot of people who were not political before, because it's touched all of our lives. Every single one of us, whether you're a businessman who is an Oxfordonian, whether you are a student, a refugee, or just an average person on the street, there's not a single one of us who hasn't been touched by this pandemic. And that might be loss of jobs, loss of family members, or simply just going mad like I am and going stir crazy at home. And ultimately, that's made people wake up. That's made people look at press briefings, watch press briefings, because they have to. They have to know what the newest restriction is going to be, what tier they're in, what tier they've skipped, right? So ultimately, what's happened is that a lot of people who weren't political are now politicized. And then they look at our European counterparts. They look at Angela Merkel with Germany. And then they look further as well with New Zealand, and other countries that are doing fantastic jobs in terms of handling this pandemic. And they think, hang on a minute, just hang on a minute. What are we doing when we can see governments across the world doing so much of a better job with handling this? And my hope is that without catastrophizing about what we've lost, we still remain part of that European family that Hannah mentioned earlier. And I absolutely still hold this as part of my identity as a dual citizen, as a half Polish and a half English person, and as a global citizen. And I also say to all of you, we might have Brexited, but we've gone nowhere. We're going nowhere, and those bonds will stay strong. Thank you.
Wow, again, absolutely nearly speechless. But if I didn't speak, we would have passed on to the next section, which is about the potential, which I think we've done an amazing job leading up to. You know, as much as it's affected everyone, you know, I think the best point to see there was made, that was people are woken up, people are tuned in, you know, people are tuned into the narrative, and this narrative they're giving us. I think it's imperative that we look at how we build a stronger narrative the one people, the general people, are tuning into, because not everyone is turned on. They're woken up, tuned in, but not all turned on. It's imperative we think about that, which is what the next section will inspire us to do. Potential. What is the future of Britain's relationship with Europe, and how can Europhiles organise? We'll be speaking with Laura and Seb. Over to you, Laura, who'll be looking at how to fight for the rights lost as a result of Brexit, but showing Scottish people who have seen the conversation. I think the Q&A, one of the questions for later, is in reference to Scottish people looking at how they can regain EU membership. Keep your ears open. Over to you, Laura. Lara.
I think you might be on mute, Lara. Lara, we can't hear you. Oh no.
We'll get there. We'll get there.
We can't hear you now. Not yet. Can you try without the headset? Can you hear? You can hear me, right? Okay. Yeah, if you try without the headset.
Also, make sure the little light next to your microphone in the top left is lit. That was what I didn't notice.
Yeah, it's on. Do you want? Okay, so shall we instead then move to Seb and Lara? Do you want to try signing in and signing out and see if that works? And then we'll come to you. I know it's a nightmare. There's so many tech difficulties. It's not just this room.
And clicking the cog icon on the bottom left, and you go to your video and audio settings. You can test your microphone there.
Yeah, that's a good point.
While we wait, if Seb would like to speak about how we can organise and deal with the situation we are not in the favour of and is not of our making, that'd be great. Over to you, Seb, when you're ready.
Thank you, Jamie. I'll do my best. Can everyone hear me? Great, excellent, perfect. Well, thank you so much, everyone. I had some fantastic contributions, and there's just a few things I just very quickly want to just reply to before I get on to my remarks. Hannah, you talked about the disconnect in the UK from European politics, from European identity. I mean, that is, of course, at the root of this. And you have, I think, this idea that somehow Britain is a unique country in its global setting. And of course, when you look at the history of Britain, it is completely intertwined with our near neighbours, where we come from. The culture of the land, the language we speak. We even have a German cadet branch of the royal family. This is a European country, and of course, our fortunes are inextricably linked to the fortunes of our neighbours, and that's something we always have to bear in mind. Hunter, you talked. I mean, you brilliantly put the case for free movement. Free movement is not about skiing holidays, which is the kind of dismissive thing that we read in the Tory tabloids. It is about ensuring that the opportunities are there for as many people as possible. There will always, of course, be people who, even with free movement, are unable to avail themselves of the opportunities. And our role in this political family is to ensure that we extend those opportunities to as many people as possible. And what free movement does is, of course, retrench those. One thing I would say, you said there was a family member, a sibling of citizens who are able to stay in Austria, and I understand that family member might be a dependent on them. They absolutely do have the right under Directive 2, I think it's 2004/38. They have the right to stay as dependents. So I would urge you to contact the 3 million on that to establish what legal pathways you might be able to explore to ensure that their rights are kept. Because obviously when you come into contact with authorities, things can indeed slip through the net, and it's very important that we make sure they don't. And then very quickly, Cecilia, thank you so much for going through that list of things that we've lost. One thing that has actually been salvaged in the deal is the e-hit card. But the government has renamed it the Global Health Insurance Card, but it actually covers fewer countries than the e-hit card. But go figure, hey? But we can't call ourselves European anymore. We have to be global. But at least at one level, we've been able to keep that. I mean, Julie, you and I have lived this kind of mad existence of scrabbling to defend what we have, and seeing actually allies kind of move away and then come back and then move away again. And it's been an incredibly difficult experience. But of course, it's all been framed with Brexit as a theoretical exercise. So we've had this theory of what Brexit might be. We've obviously had very clear ideas of what would happen. But for most people, it's completely intangible, something impossible to quantify. And so, of course, the narrative has been, well, it was voted for, therefore it has to be delivered. And anybody who's saying it can't be delivered is obviously therefore frustrating the will of the people. Now Brexit is tangible. Now it's real. And as hideous and awful as leaving the European Union is, and will be for many people, and for many businesses, and for many communities, and for many young people whose opportunities have been curtailed, we have at last the ability, nonetheless, to demonstrate to people what Brexit is and how much worse off we as a country will be and could be if we continue on the path of divergence. I mean, first of all, we have to be very clear when we talk about our position in the world, that we are realistic about where we fit into all of this. So I was really enthused, I suppose, to hear Keir yesterday say that we're a pro-European party. That's music to my ears, because of course we are. But I do have a lot of doubts about this idea that the UK can be this sort of bridge between the EU and the US. We have to be realistic about where people see the UK's role and what our usefulness is outside the European Union. Of course, we're not completely adrift and all the rest of it. We do have a function to play, but we really have to sort our own house in order, and we need a credible European policy. And part of that is responding to the kind of distinct losses that people have outlined already today. And I'm afraid a big part of that is free movement. We cannot continue to be an internationalist party, to be a party that ascribes itself a pro-European label, if we, on the other hand, are lukewarm about what is undoubtedly the biggest retraction in citizens' rights since the war. This is something that we have to be energized about and prepared to campaign for, even, of course, if at the moment the response to that is somewhat muted. We have to be prepared for that muted response, but also understand that it's getting our own house in order that is incredibly important. But the thing that I want to really impress on you is this. Asinine ideas, which is what Brexit is, asinine ideas do not last. They cannot last. And there is this sort of, I think, desperation, certainly within the government, who now think, look, we've done this, we've delivered on our manifesto pledge. Everything that goes forward from here on in will be about expanding Britain's potential. And the Labour leadership and party as a whole, perhaps, that wants this issue to go away because it was a difficult one for us. The Brexit coalition did win the election for the Prime Minister, not on Brexit. And Julie's absolutely right on this. It wasn't Brexit that won it, but it was part of it, right? So the Labour Party is kind of allergic to saying anything that's anti-Brexit at the moment. So both political parties just want it to go away. And the reality is, of course, it can't and it won't. We're a developed democracy. We have an informed electorate. We have an educated citizenry. It is simply impossible for that citizenry to ignore a systemic disadvantage, which is what Brexit is. This country, Britain, is now at a systemic disadvantage compared to its European neighbours on a whole raft of things, most of which we have outlined this morning. And it's simply not possible to build a future on that without, whilst pretending that we can somehow ignore ignore that systemic disadvantage. And that's really my plea. Go out into your communities, listen to how businesses are suffering. Already, for example, we have small businesses completely incapable of navigating the paperwork that they need. This is the immediate effect. As we go further down the road, it will hit more and more people, more and more sectors in different walks of life. We need to collate that. We need to make the case. We need to show them that there is a party listening. And my appeal to all of my FEPs and PES sisters and brothers out there is this: don't treat the Labour Party, the British Labour Party, with kid gloves. Critique it, and don't be afraid to say where we're getting things wrong, because we really do need our sister parties out there to say, you know, you guys, you really need to understand what the position is as we see it, as we understand it, because that framing is incredibly important. But I'm absolutely 100% convinced one day Britain, or what is left of it, and there's a huge issue to do with what the impact will be on the Union, Britain and what's left of it will be back in the European family. And our job is to try and minimize that time and to try and mitigate the damage that will be caused in that time, and to be a voice for people who are experiencing that damage and to show them that we're representing them.
Brilliantly said. Thank you so much, Seb. So many good points made there, and especially for us as young Fabians to make sure we are still a voice for those who are vulnerable and may not have it and may need one, and to keep critiquing Labour policies, the Labour Party, every manifesto that comes out, every leader that comes around, and make sure that it's still as fair, as morally just, as principled as we can possibly make it. Lara, could I check if you've got audio?
Hi.
Yes, brilliant.
Excellent.
We can hear you. Brilliant.
I had audio in this beginning.
Brilliant. We've managed to overcome some international audio issues. Other speakers, could you please mute? I heard some typing. Just make sure that you're muted. And Lara, could we go to you?
Yes, thank you. Yeah, I'll talk about some of the rights of EU nationals and how that has been affected. And I'm glad that Seb brought up issues with the Labour Party, because I've got some points on that too. So yeah, I'm a dual Brazilian Italian national. I've been in the UK for about 7 years. And I think one thing that's always been really interesting about Brexit is that I've had people tell me like, oh, but I voted for Brexit because I want more people like you in the country. And I'm like, well, okay, but I'm here using my Italian passport, so you're not actually helping that very much. I'm also the co-manager of the Young Europeans Network, which is the youth wing of the 3 Million, an organization that I'm sure all of you are very familiar with, because we've had to campaign so much on EU nationals' rights, because the government has not done such great work on our rights. Firstly, there were the promises made by the Vote Leave campaign that there would be no changes to EU nationals' rights that were currently living lawfully in the UK. That has not been the fact. We've had to, of course, apply for the EU settlement scheme, which in the beginning cost £60, and we've had to campaign for that cost to be dropped. And the fact itself that our status is digital only is not very secure. Just 2 days ago, we saw that there were over 400,000 records in the police database that were lost, and it doesn't make me very, very comfortable knowing that I don't have any physical backup if I have to show it to a future employer, a landlord, social services, or anything like that. And those are serious concerns that the 3 Million is working on, because we're talking about vulnerable residents, elderly residents, or those that are not digitally literate, who may never have used a digital system and will not be able to do that. Another big concern is with regards to those who may end up not even applying for the settlement scheme. We're talking about rough sleepers, victims of modern slavery, or those fleeing domestic violence. And there's a real fear that in July, they will suddenly be unlawfully resident in the UK. And a lot of frontline workers, activists have taken up that role. I am trained to give a little bit of advice on applying for settled status, because the government has really given up on reaching out to EU communities in the UK. So activists have really had to take up that role, but it's not good enough because a lot of organizations and immigration solicitors have been saying that this could end up being like the next Windrush. And I know that that's a term that is thrown around a lot, but it is the case that a lot of people might end up losing their rights from July. And there's also the case of children who are born to EU parents in the UK. There's a bit of misconception there on whether or not they have to apply. And we fear that those who are born in the UK, when they have to go to university, for example, they may suddenly see that they don't have its status anymore. And another thing that the Young Europeans have been working on is on student rights and how absences due to COVID will affect their status in the UK, because a lot of EU students have gone back to their home country to study from home, and if they spend more than 6 months outside the UK, they lose their continuous residence. And that's a really big issue because, well, if everyone's trying to keep safe, the government is advising us to keep safe and remain indoors, then they can't blame EU students for doing just that. And another thing that I think is really interesting and it hasn't really been talked about very much is regarding democratic rights. So EU nationals have up to now been able to vote in local elections. And for the 2021 local elections, that right is guaranteed. However, after that, it's not guaranteed. It's up for negotiation. And the government is refusing to do a unilateral approach of giving EU nationals currently in the UK the right to vote. At the moment, it's only Poland, Luxembourg, Spain, and Portugal that have signed that agreement. So I don't know if I will be able to vote after that. But this is something that can be done. It's not difficult. Scotland and Wales already do offer residence-based voting rights for those with limited leave to remain in the UK. So England could just as well do it. I would much prefer, my personal view is to have a residence-based voting right for all migrants and expand that to general elections as well. I mean, I have campaigned for the Labour Party. I have worked for members of parliament. The only thing that I haven't been able to do is actually vote for a member of parliament. So that's something that we'll be campaigning on a lot this year in terms of maintaining that right to vote. And another thing that, as I said, that the Labour Party can and must do more is on representing EU nationals as well. From the research that we have done in the 3 million, we found one Romanian councillor in the UK, and there are over 400,000 Romanian nationals in the UK. I'm not saying that there is only one, but there is no data available on that besides our independent research. And that's something that we think that can be done much better. Maybe like CLPs can be offering, keeping track of that record much more closely so that we can improve representation, because without the data, there's little that we can go on. And also, when I've campaigned in local elections, I've had councillors tell me that I couldn't vote in local elections because I wasn't British. That's wrong. Unless I committed electoral fraud many times. But those were Labour councillors, and the Labour Party has to do more on that, because they can't assume that people will take up on themselves to be aware of their rights. I believe that CLPs can be providing their councillors or their candidates with information about who can vote and how to reach out to encourage those EU nationals and others to register to vote and vote. We can't be taken for granted. I've had conversations with Conservative supporters and Conservative councillors who informally have said that they're not very interested in maintaining and expanding the rights of EU nationals to vote because they don't think that we would vote for them. So there's no reason why the Labour Party shouldn't be taking up this to encourage us to vote and to be more engaged in party politics. Hi, Anna. That was in Cambridge, but I will not blame anyone there personally. But generally as well, me personally, I'm engaging with and trying to start a network called Migrants for Labour, just to try to encourage more migrants to stand for local elections and work on policies that affect us. So that I saw someone say that we should stop complaining and actually do something. So if anyone is interested, I want to do that as well. And finally, the government has been saying that we are their friends and neighbours, but in reality, that's not true. That's not how their policies have reflected the rhetoric.
Fight on is all I can say. And yeah, and of course, everyone who's spoken so far, we're going to be handing back to Penny, who was going to talk about, back in the personal section, explaining feelings of being European and British and having identity taken away. And a quick one as well, Laura, what you said, of course they don't care about Europeans. Brexit was all about tearing down solidarity and getting rid of cooperation. And the thing is, the opposite, the antithesis, because solidarity knows no borders, and we must see the fight. Penny, when you're ready, we'll hand over to you, unless another speaker has anything to say.
Agree. And just quickly before Penny, you start, just to participants, we're going to go over deliberately a little bit, just because Penny had some audio and tech issues before. So
trial version.
We still will be able to take a couple of questions if you're happy to stick around. Please do. Penny is great, and we've got such a fantastic panel. And also big thank you to Lara just now, really good points made about the deliberate erosion of European democracy, Labour needing to better represent European residents. And we would love to support you with Migrants for Labour. So please do reach out. The Young Fabians, I'm sure, would be happy to help. Penny, over to you.
Hi, sorry about the earlier technical difficulties, and thank you to everyone who spoke. It was all very moving and informative.
Trial version.
So growing up Cypriot in the UK and as part of a Southern European culture meant I was always in touch with my European identity. Greek was my first language,
Trial version.
and it's still the primary language spoken at home. I remember, aged just 5, seeing the creation of the euro on the news and asking my parents when Britain would be joining.
Trial version.
Cyprus joining in 2004 was something which I felt united my British and Cypriot identities with a common European identity, and I've always felt at home in other European countries and have always appreciated the EU's mantra, united in diversity. From Portugal to Poland, from west to east, Europe always felt like home. Being Cypriot, I was also very aware of the EU's potential as an institution for change. Despite failing and Cyprus joining the EU as a divided island, the Annan Plan brought Cyprus closer to reunification than at any point since 1974. It also gave influence and credibility to Cyprus as a small island nation surrounded by larger neighbours. Reading Mark Leonard's book, Why Europe Will Run the 21st Century, at age 15, I was hooked on the idea of a Europe which cooperated across borders and worked together. Studying EU politics at university gave me a broader understanding of those inner workings of the EU. In 2016, I campaigned hard for Remain and subsequently for a People's Vote. And after both 2016 and 2019, I felt a profound sense of loss at my European identity being taken away against my will. I felt the link between my British and Cypriot identities both severed, and felt less British and Cypriot as a result. This loss of identity, which I felt was a fundamental part of who I am, made me feel unwelcome in my own country, and for the first time, like I couldn't recognise the place I grew up. This, coupled with an increase in racial abuse post-Brexit, meant that whenever I spoke up about the negative impacts or the effects, I was regularly told on online forums to go back to where I came from, despite being born in London, or was told to leave the country and treated as other. I don't like what Brexit has awakened in the country or what it's enabled in the place that I've called home my whole life. So what's next? Like me or people like us. Rejoin currently is not a viable option with the issues we're facing internally, and we have to resolve them before any campaign to rejoin. But in the meantime, we must maintain our cultural links and cooperation as much as possible, and Labour must put internationalism at the heart of everything that they do. Above all, in 2021, we must be hopeful. With Trump on his way out and populism seemingly on the decline in this country with Labour's recent polling gains, we must make this the year of cooperation and reconciliation, both across the deep divide between Remain and Leave and with our friends, allies and neighbours in Europe. I'd like to conclude with a quote from one of the great literary figures from across the Channel, Alexander Dumas, from his book The Three Musketeers, and hope it's a mantra we will live by from 2021 onwards. All for one and one for all.
Trial version.
Yes, Annie, that is what a lovely quote ended on, and hope everyone was listening very, very clearly there, because there's some really important stuff.
Trial version.
If anyone is hearing any technical difficulties through that speech, but we're going to move into some Q&A. Again, it is lunchtime now, but please, with such a great host of speakers, I'd love it if you could put some more questions in the chat. We've got some questions upvoted already. So just a few pieces I want to touch on in response to Julie instead, I think are really worth noting. You know, Julie, at the end of your thing, we kind of touched on the effect of the past 30 years on the electorate and the way it's influenced outcome. And Seb, you mentioned, you know, we live in a developed democracy, and, you know, Brexit is a, you know, I see it in a sense a coup. But in the words of Ralph Miliband, I like to rephrase it, we live in a capitalist democracy. We must be critical of that, because we must understand it very clearly. And Ralph Miliband wrote a great book called Capitalist Democracy in Britain. And the point I was really interested in was, you know, how can we rebuild UK-EU solidarity without, you know, you mentioned we've got to have our own house in order, and we got to have it in order and in our control. How can we rebuild UK-EU solidarity without rebuilding English, Scottish, Irish, Welsh solidarity first? I think that's really important. My biggest fear, and this is what the Q&A kind of talks on as well, is Scottish independence or Welsh independence. And while I do agree in the long run it may be a better outcome for working towards international solidarity, but I see it as it would be a loss to the Englishman to lose his Welsh, Irish and Scottish compadres in this battle, because we're stronger together. So the question is, would be keen to hear you, but Julie and Seb touched on from what you talked about, was how can we rebuild how can we rebuild UK-EU solidarity without first rebuilding English, Scottish, Irish, Welsh solidarity? You know, what do you both think about that, Julie and Seb?
Oh, yeah. Do you want? Yeah, I mean, I completely agree. And actually, I mean, what we're going to see with, so there's going to be a Scottish parliamentary election probably in spring, but if it's delayed because of the pandemic, I wouldn't have thought it would be much later than the autumn. I mean, it could be next year, but whatever. We're going to have it soon. And clearly, the SNP look as if they're going to win big. And clearly, there's going to be a huge call for an independence referendum. And what we will see is a complete flip of arguments. We will see the Tories arguing that staying together and being part of a big market and ensuring that we have continuity for business and certainty and all the rest of it, that will be paramount. And we'll have the SNP arguing that there won't be any disruption to the border between England and Scotland, that Scotland can be completely separate and that's absolutely fine and it can make its own destiny. That's exactly what will happen, and then we'll do it shamelessly. And here is a huge opportunity for the Labour Party to say what is right, which is actually the only logical position for Scotland is in a united kingdom, in a united Europe. That is the only logical position, and we're the only ones that can say that. But of course, you know, my reference to getting our house in order is we need a credible European policy for the UK as a whole in order to be able to have justification for that position. And that's really where I worry we might be putting ourselves in a hole. But you're absolutely right. We need that solidarity everywhere. The idea that you can pick and choose, you know, your internationalism, I don't think it works that way.
Yeah, I just want to say something about democracy, because we might have democracy, but we've got very poor quality democracy. And I think we've got to start talking about quality democracy, because the referendum disenfranchised the main groups of people who were going to be impacted by the result. Also, Scottish 16 and 17-year-olds were allowed to vote in the September before the referendum in their own referendum about whether or not to stay in the UK, but were then disenfranchised from voting in the referendum on EU continued membership. So I think there's lots of issues about quality democracy, and the word democracy has been thrown around with far too freely, in a way, to legitimize actually what has been a power grab. Okay, and in fact, what the Tories don't want is an educated citizenry who understand what they have lost. So I think it's our job to, and I do agree that many people have woken up. There's been a kind of politicization, and in fact, the pandemic has created these huge spaces for us to attend lots of educational conferences. I have attended, not just to speak, but to listen and to learn, probably more than 100 conferences and meetings online since last March, which means that I have learned an enormous amount about all sorts of issues that I didn't understand before. And I think that when we do finally get back, we're going to have people who are not, who are much more knowledgeable about a whole range of different issues, and hopefully we'll be very vocal about those things as well. The other thing is that we need not just digital inclusion. We need digital and media literacy. We've got to better educate people so that they can question the prevailing narratives that are being pushed forward all the time. And that means, that means really trying to change what is happening in some of our schools, and giving teachers and educators and significant others the tools to do that. So, let's try and use all the things that we've learned over the past year, which I think has exposed the cracks in our society and in our political system. Let's try and use that to make sure that the next generation and indeed their parents, older people, it's interesting, older people kind of understood a lot of things about because very, very old people didn't vote out, by the way, they voted in because they had lived through the war. But there's a kind of missing generation of people who never had access to, and to, if you like, decent citizenship education, but also hadn't experienced what what happened in the war. So that missing generation of people in the middle certainly ought to be attending WEA citizenship classes.
I think you make a great point, Julie, about the generation, and Seb, I really appreciate all you had to say. And I think it's really important. You talk about media, and I mentioned the narrative earlier, and you talk about that generation. And I wouldn't say so much to say missed. I'd say, my parents, both from that generation, both my parents voted Brexit, and much to my dismay. But it wasn't a case of missed. They've been, what happens when you get 40 years of media shoved down your throat that isn't in your best interest. It's like a turkey being convinced to vote for Christmas, simple as that. I really think we've had a really great panel so far, and everything's been really, really interesting. And some of the questions we've got, what I really liked from Susanna Lord, which Hunter talked about, but I think it's very much in the avenue of what we talked about. She asked, how can we make ties between Europe and the UK for young people who are not wealthy? And how can we work to create a more positive impression of the EU within the UK? I'd really like any panelists who can speak on that to take a second, think about that, and really think about the alternative angles that we can look at to maintain ties, things we haven't touched on, and outside the box of how we can make a more positive impression of the UK within the EU. And when we say the EU, I want us to think of Europe in general, not just the EU, because we talked about when we rejoin the EU with what Julie mentioned. It may not be rejoin the EU, maybe something else by this point, but really think big with these answers. So the question was, how can we maintain ties between the Europe and the UK for young people who are not wealthy? I think of outside the box ties like the groups we've already talked about, and how can we create a more positive impression in the wake of Brexit about the UK in Europe? Anyone, when they got a sec, put your hand up and we'll pass over to you.
So can I actually come to Lara first, as we didn't have her on the last question. I'd like to come in on a couple of points, and then Hunter had his hand up as well. And this, I think, will have to be our closing question as we've gone over quite a bit. So panelists, please feel free to add in your closing remarks when we come to you. Thanks.
Hunter, would you like to go first? Because I saw that you had your hand up, and while I think of something.
Hunter, there's no audio. Your face. Oh, it's coming in.
Oh, it's fine. I'm happy to go then. It's interesting when we think about like how to rebuild those bridges and everything. We've been trying, as the young Europeans, we've been trying to mostly we focus on promoting, maintaining rights and expanding rights. And I have noticed that on our social media, we've been getting some pushback from British nationals and from non-EU nationals on the privilege of Europeans, especially attaching EU to whiteness. And I don't have the answer to that. However, I do think that in conversations like about the benefits of Europe, we do have to be aware of that. That is something that our rhetoric can shape how others perceive what we're campaigning for. But then I'll go back to what I said in the beginning. I am in the UK because of my European passport, even though I was born and raised in Brazil. And you find many South Americans in the UK who come through that same route. So we have just, I at least see the EU as beyond, as someone said, I think Cecilia, it's not just the EU, not just the continent of Europe. It goes much broader than that. And I also believe in leveling up the rights of migrants, not stopping at EU nationals. So I think that is important about how we talk about rebuilding those bridges and creating that identity of the UK, especially as someone said as well about using the rhetoric of the government. They talk about Brexit so that we will have global Britain. That involves then having global Brits. It involves opening up opportunities for UK nationals to live, work, study abroad, and also welcoming migrants into the UK, because, well, we know that migrants will not stop being in the UK, and it does go both ways. So it's something that it's not going to stop, and we don't want it to stop. So we just have to promote it in the most positive way possible, I think.
Completely agree, Lara. Thank you. And from my own perspective, my answer to that in terms of how do we keep those ties, sustain those ties, and form new ties would be really simple. Join a think tank. The Young Fabians, for example, we have tons of European members from all over the world, people from all walks of life. Look at Foundation for European Progressive Steps, which is part of this conference, not confidence, and PES, like all the members. If you Google Party of European Socialists, so PES, they've got hundreds of members. SBO from Austria. I've personally talked to one of the members from Partido Socialista, which is the Portuguese Socialist Party. PASOK, PSOE, there's think tanks and organizations from Poland to Denmark to France to Finland to Germany. Join a think tank, join an organization that aligns with your views and has a wealth of international members. And that way you can not only sustain your ties, but create new ones. So next, I'd like to come to you, Julie, on your thoughts of how we sustain, create, and continue those ties.
Well, I worked in the education and culture sector before I was in politics, and I was already a member of a number of networks and organisations, so I'm going to suggest that they're quite useful because they're not just about EU. So they're that broader kind of pan-European geographic networks that include Norway, Switzerland, Turkey. So Culture Action Europe is a fantastic network if you're working in any form of cultural activity, and that doesn't just mean arts. Often people tend to think that culture is about arts, and it's not. So it's about being active, really. And Culture Action Europe is a network which also advocates very strongly within the European Parliament and at EU Commission level, and is listened to, but is much broader. So look at some of these networks: Cultural Action Europe, also Solidar. Solidar is our sort of families social action network that includes trade union membership, adult education, informal education, campaigning, human rights, and it promotes a kind of global vision, really, about the values that we care about. And I work really closely with Solidar. They have an award every year, and so I've been participating in the process of looking at the award nominations, and in fact it was a fantastic project from Lancashire that won the Education Award in this last year. So, and Solidar have a regular newsletter they put out, and there's loads of opportunities in there that you can participate in. Hunter and I actually met at Young European Socialist Summer Camp. Now, I'm not young, but I was always there because I work in youth policy and education policy and culture policy. And I was really quite sad about the way that some people in the party had tried to stop young Labour members attending Young European Socialists. So then make sure you're there, okay? Don't let the party prevent you from participating in these gatherings. They're really important and very empowering. And then there's also a network called Amateo, which is the network for participation at amateur level. So, whether or not you're because the arts isn't just about musicians who've lost their rights to go and tour and earn lots of money, through doing it for a living. It's also a way to build that. It's also a way to build self-confidence and explore how to, how to come together in those cultural ways, like, for example, singing together in choirs. Lots of town twinning things still exist, even in Brexity places. Like, I represented Workington, and there's a pole in the middle of Workington town, and it's got different signposts to different parts of Europe to recognise all the different places that Workington is twinned with. So there are still connections, even at deep level, even within those red wall areas. So I think that's what we have to do, is just pour lots and lots of energy into celebrating, our common humanity and the fact that actually we're all on one planet, and we can't solve our problems unless we're working together.
Great.
Really well said.
Over to Hunter.
Yeah, sorry about the mic issues. It kept knocking me off also, Laura. Going back to the original question about how do you get more working class people and people without means participating, it's like I said, it's about providing travel funds. So we have on the Young European Socialist Bureau, it's around like 30 members. I'm the only person who pays out of pocket to go there to those events. I'm the only person who doesn't get a travel reimbursement. This is the reality. When I tell other people on the Bureau that, like, they'll be like, oh, why aren't you going to this thing? And I'm like, I can't afford to go to this thing. And they're like, oh, you'll get your travel reimbursement. It'll be fine. And I'm like, no, dude, I don't get a travel reimbursement. This is just like me lighting money on fire. That's like the reality of it. So, it's great to join organizations, join think tanks, do all this stuff. but that's also money out every month. Fees you're paying into membership dues, and then also money you're paying to go to trips. And also, you know, even within the UK, you know, we wonder why things are so centralized into London around labor. It's because it's really hard to move around the country. It's really, really expensive. So, you know, if labor wants to be serious about reconnecting people, young people with Europe, provide a little bit of money for a hostel and cover their plane ticket. It's not brain science. It's not inventing the wheel. It's already been done. And every other party, whether it's a poor party in Croatia or a very wealthy party like the SPD, they have money at minimum just to send their international officers to attend things, or the members that are on the boards of organizations to go to events. Like that's the level where like labor is at. Like we don't even see the importance of having our own officers attend the board meetings of the organizations they're a part of. Or, for example, covering the costs of the fees for them to be members of these organizations. So effectively, it just becomes a money sink. You know, Young Labor is technically still a participant in Young European Socialists, but has not been there even once in the 3 years I've been active. Like they have a bureau seat and they do not choose to exercise it. And, you know, this isn't something that, you know, shouldn't be a political issue. It's that young people need access. This is an opportunity for them. If we are not providing the resources for people to achieve that, we are failing. If we are not promoting it well, we are failing. And if we're still spending money to do this, then we're also doing it in a very stupid way. So, you know, you want more people participating, help them get to where they're going and provide them a place to sleep and a little bit of food when they get there. And that's how you can have working class people go to fancy events and meet really cool people. And that's how other parties allow their working class people to go to fancy events and meet important people. You know, we got to stop thinking that because we're Britain on this island, we have to do something new and different. The idea is there. Let's just be smart and take a good idea and make it our own.
Absolutely. And so well said, Hunter. It's like Angela Rayner said yesterday, I steal with pride, share best practice and take ideas where they're there and they're brilliant and listen to people and what they want and what they need instead of just us telling them what we're about. You know, funding is such a simple solution. And yeah, really, really good point. Thank you. Seb, could we come to you for closing remarks and your answer to this really, really good question?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, first of all, I agree with everything that's just been said, and particularly on the networks points. You know, it's very easy for people to be slightly disparaging and say, "Oh, it's just a junket," you know. But actually, Hunter, you're absolutely spot on that these are really important things. And then actually, this speaks to the wider point about closing ourselves off from networks. The jobs of tomorrow are going to rely on networks, and it's not just in politics. You know, people are going to have to compete with AI, not just in traditional manufacturing settings, but in a whole range of workplaces. We have to build those networks, and we have to think with that mentality of how we plug ourselves into increasing, you know, cross-border networks. That's the future in terms of our economy. One thing I would say is there are two chat things open, so I don't know which I've posted in the right ones, and there's a story today, and there's a story every day about small businesses in particular waking up and finding themselves hit with huge charges they never knew anything about. And now those of us who knew what leaving the EU meant obviously knew what was coming, but so many people who are antipathetic towards politics and Brexit kind of thought that things would just be fine with the deal. And we're going to find a huge audience of people willing to, you know, who are angry, frankly, at what's happened. They didn't realize what Brexit would be. And they need a political movement to be there, ready to listen to them. And I think it's incumbent on all of us to make that point within, you know, our respective positions in local and national politics. And one thing, just speaking to the network point that we haven't touched on, is local authorities and cities and regions. In that there is no reason whatsoever why being outside the European Union shouldn't mean that cities don't reach out to one another and share best practice and talk to each other. And we need to kind of work at those levels as well, because they're really important. And just my parting thing on messaging, we all here know that the idea that if you're born in a particular part of the world, you somehow have a better, more, a higher value than anyone else is a completely ridiculous and stupid idea. But nonetheless, patriotism is here to stay, I'm afraid. And now patriotism can be an awful thing. It can be a horrible thing, but we can turn it into something positive. And I think in that sense, what we want our patriotism to be, and this is where I would appeal to the Labour leadership in its messaging when it wants to say, look, we're on the side of hardworking communities and ordinary people, is that patriotism means being international. Patriotism means making ourselves stronger, not dividing ourselves or walking away from the decision-making tables. And I honestly think that if we start to frame it in those terms, we have a winning formula. We are missing an open goal, I think, by being afraid of the issue of capital B Brexit. We don't even need to call it that. We can call it what we like, but it's about being connected, about being international, and about being proud about what we can achieve together as human beings in order to develop positive solutions for our communities.
Wow, Seb, that was excellent. And just over to Hannah and then Pani, and then we'll probably all close for the day. And thank you everyone for bearing with so far. It's all been absolutely amazing. Hannah, when you're ready.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, in terms of how we can connect Europe and the UK, I think from an institutional point of view, I'm a little bit repeating views already, but I think that it's important to offer funded opportunities in terms of work and study. So across socioeconomic sector areas. So for example, my cousin in Austria is a farmer or becomes a farmer, and he had the opportunity to go to Northern Ireland to look at farming techniques there. And I thought that was amazing. And he was so fascinated by different techniques and ways to do it. And the same thing should be reversed, that we have farmers from England, Scotland, coming to Austria and Germany and Italy as well, see all sorts of techniques and just share knowledge and share perspectives. And also to promote it. I think so many people aren't even aware, for example, of Erasmus and how it works. And that's something that's very important, I think, as well. Open it up to people, promote it. It needs to be more available and accessible. And from an individual point of view, I also agree, travel and funded travel. I can't remember the term, but back when my mom was younger, there was traveling by train all across Europe. Somebody probably shouts the word out.
Interrail.
Thank you. That needs to be established again. There is a movement right now coming from Berlin, Germany, on funded Interrail again. So that's something that I think needs to be pushed for. And engage in the discussion by reading European issues as well. Listening to podcasts, understanding what's going on in Europe right now. The German election was right now with the Social Democrats, or what's going on in France, things like that. Just engage in the European discussion. What's going on there? What are Europeans concerned about all across different nations, and see how that maybe affect the UK as well, and how can we learn, as we already said, how can we learn from other countries for the UK, and how we can bring our knowledge from the UK back to Europe as well. So just having in discussion on blogs, with your friends in school, at universities, at work, everywhere. We need to have that European discussion again. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hannah. And we're just going to hand over to Pani, and then we'll finish. I just want to say again, thank you everyone so much for your time today. Speakers, participants, it's been a really lovely evening. It's been the first of many great international network events for the year. And yeah, dream big and really think about how we can make 2021 the best year yet for us as people, as Fabians, and as comrades. Over to you, Pani.
Pani, you might be on mute. It's like Sadiq Khan's firework or drone display. You're on mute. Still can't hear you, Pani, though.
Not yet, Pani.
Did he just leave? Oh, yes.
He'll be back in a sec, but Yeah, like the biggest thing I've taken away from today is the faith in continuing building solidarity outside of the borders from what we once have, and it really makes me dream big, thinking about what it could look like. Will it be the EU? Will it even be called the EU? Whatever we rejoin in the future. And Penny's back. Penny, can we hear you? Yes, perfect.
Go for it.
Yeah.
As you're ready.
Yeah. So to start with, I'd just like to echo what everyone else has said about funding. It would genuinely change like people's attitudes and people's way of thinking about things if we were able to go to these events, and if young British socialists were able to go to these events with other Europeans, it would really, really transform like what we can achieve working across borders. And I'd just like to echo what Seb said about patriotism. So for me, patriotism isn't about building walls, it's about building bridges and ensuring that we as a country are stronger and more well connected. And it's about like so the Tories talk about patriotism in a nationalistic, jingoistic way. My way of thinking about nationalism is I don't want to see veterans on the street. I don't want to see children growing up and us debating whether they get to eat food. I want to see us having an environment where everyone in this country is able to achieve their potential. And I think just to kind of look at it at a micro level, one of the things which really struck me is when I visited the Eden Project in Cornwall, where they voted to leave the EU, and that was a disused clay pit. Thanks to funding from the EU and like they managed to transform it into a world-leading science facility with good high-tech jobs for people here in the UK, and that is the power of what the EU can do, and that is what the power of what working across borders and international solidarity can do. That part of Cornwall is now a hub for scientists across the world to come and learn and grow together, and that I think is fantastic. And one final point, I think beyond our solidarity with our fellow Europeans, we have to look across the world, whether that's dealing with climate change, which has to be done globally, or whether that is working with other regional international groups like Mercosur or the Association of Southeast Asian Nations or the African Union or whatever it may be. We have to work across borders, because if we don't, then we're just a little island in the middle of the Atlantic, and that's not the future I want for this country, and that's not the future that any patriot would want for this country. So
definitely.
Damn right.
Thank you so much, Penny. I'm just going to mute you, sorry, because that trial version thing is going to come through. I promise that Penny is not, in fact, a trial version. He is very professional and an excellent panelist. So a massive, massive thank you to all of you speakers who have you've borne with us. We've had lots of tech issues. It happens. We've all spoken on mute before. And that's life. But thank you so much for spending extra time with us, for coming, for saying so many things that resonated so deeply, certainly with myself, and I think with the wider Fabians and FEPS members, in terms of not just catastrophizing about what we've lost, which is important to record and to recognize, but also on how to mitigate that loss. Seb on continuing as well to critique the Labour Party and how patriotism can be a force for good when not weaponized. Hannah and Hunter for making great points and providing funded travel opportunities and much more. A brilliant exposition by Lara on the assault on European residents' rights and what we can do to mitigate that. Julie with a fantastic call to action on still fighting for our global citizen identity, and Penny on the emergence of othering narratives around European residents post-Brexit and the importance of recognising and combating that. So thank you also to all of our participants for sticking around. It's been brilliant. So great to have you. Thank you for your questions. Apologies if we weren't able to get to everyone, but it's fun watching. You all have seen what's happened. And finally, for me, as I said earlier, we may have Brexited, but in my heart, personally, we've gone nowhere. We're still a family and will continue to be one. So thank you. And have a great rest of your weekend. Thank you, everyone.